Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special AI-focused episode of Media Voices. I'm Chris Sutcliffe.
And I'm Esther Thorpe.
No Peter this week, unfortunately, but we are joined by a fantastic guest, Jacqui Merrington, who's going to take us through everything to do with AI and journalism in 2023. Before we get into that, Esther, we do have an event coming up, don't we?
We do. Funnily enough, it's an AI event. We're collaborating with Media Makers Meet. We're doing MX3 AI on the 7th of December in London. I think the idea is we're going to be exploring all things AI and the opportunities, challenges, and all that for publishers. The agenda, I think, is actually coming this week. So go to mx3ai.com for more.
Fantastic. But as mentioned this week, we are joined by Jacqui Merrington, who recently left Reach after 17 years. So she's led one of the first generative AI experiments at Reach, as well as devising and leading a project aimed at developing new business models for the smallest local news sites using AI, interactive content formats, and newsletters. And now, Jacqui, you have your own Substack as well, don't you? So why don't you first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to come on. Why don't you take us through The Happy Journalist?
Thanks ever so much, Chris, and lovely to see you both this morning. The Happy Journalist, I guess, is my take on all the good stuff that's happening in journalism, and particularly local journalism. I love this industry, and I've always been an optimist, and I really feel invested in the future sustainability of journalism. I think we're an industry that's quite full of cynics, and as a result, I think the industry does,
Sorry.
And I think a lot of journalists talk this industry down, but actually there's so much good stuff happening. There's so many brilliant people who work in journalism. There's people making a difference in the world, and there's so many fantastic initiatives happening across the industry. And I think they deserve to have the spotlight shone on them. And I know you do that at Media Voices, and I know that happens. That does happen across the industry. But I felt like there was a space for taking a really positive look at journalism.
Nice, fantastic. Well, we'd urge everybody then to go out and check out The Happy Journalist, because I think that we do need that as a bit of an antidote to some of the cynicism and pessimism. Less so on this episode, obviously, because Peter's not here. But so, obviously, the topic of today's discussion is going to be AI, generative AI, what that means for journalism, and what it does under the hood for journalism as well, and journalism business models. And Esther, you've mentioned in the notes, I think, that so many of us who've actually seen Gen AI in practice are a little bit pessimistic about what it means for journalism.
Well, I think AI is not a new thing, right? Publishers have been using AI for probably around 5 years, maybe a bit longer for some experiments. And I think we've always sort of looked at it and thought, you see how that's helping the newsroom, making processes more efficient, helping, source traffic reports, stories, that sort of thing. And then when generative AI came out last November, I think it was a bit of a wake-up moment, because we suddenly saw that actually these chatbots or whatever you want to call them, they can actually generate some really quite comprehensive content. And yes, you can pick at them, you can say, yes, it's not original, that sort of thing. But I think it's the first time a lot of us kind of stared down the face of something could actually be replacing us. So I love the fact that Jacqui's optimistic about this. I would actually love to know why Jacqui's optimistic about this, because it's I think the start of this year was the first time I felt a little bit of an existential threat to writers.
Oh, look, I understand that. I think AI brings an existential threat to the world. But I think
this is so optimistic.
But I think journalism has a really important role to play in making sense of that, communicating it, understanding it, kind of shaping the narrative around it. I'm old enough to remember when the internet came along. And I think that in the media, we were quite slow to react. We decided that online content might cannibalize print. So we all buried our heads in the sand for a bit too long. And it felt like we were always on the back foot with that. I think generative AI will potentially, I think somebody, Steve Hasker at Thomson Reuters a few weeks ago, was credited with saying it will be an even bigger change than the internet. And I think for me, that means we've got to get on the front foot with it. We've got to, understand the pace of change, understand why people are nervous about it. But this time we've got newsrooms full of people who are quite eager to try things out, to experiment, to learn. And I think as an industry, again, we're looking really narrowly through the lens of what's this going to do to journalism, what's it going to do to us in the media. But if we look at AI as this kind of paradigmatic shift in how the world works, something that will be everywhere, it will be affecting everyone, then I think journalists are in a really good place to learn quickly, to interpret it, to communicate it, to help people navigate through that change. We're used to disruption, aren't we? We're early adopters. We can be early adopters. And I think if journalists feel that AI is a tool that can empower them and that they've got a place in the world to sort of help others navigate the change that AI brings to the world, then I think that puts us in quite a good place.
Yeah, certainly. Particularly, like you said, it's almost the extension of journalism's mission to keep the public informed. And if it is as, great a shift as I think we all expect it to be, then of course we need to take a sort of leading role in explaining that, understanding it ourselves so that we can communicate that to the public. What would you say then to, obviously, Geo Media earlier in the year, they published a bunch of wholly AI generated articles without the input of editors or journalists, and they were pretty much castigated at the time for being riddled with errors. And despite that, Geo Media management said, we're going to be doing more like wholly AI generated articles. Would you see that as a sort of a bad example of early adoption of this kind of stuff without necessarily taking the time to consider what that might mean?
Yes. And I think, I think, I'm not saying that AI can't write articles. It can. I've used it to write stories. I've used it to research stories. I've used it to rewrite stories. There's so much that it can do. And I think we're only at the start of learning all the things that it can do. I think the most important thing with it is going to be transparency. Because it can write a story at the moment. It can't write a very good story, but it can write a story. That it will get better. And I think there has to be a kind of code which says we need to be transparent about where AI is being used and how AI is being used in the creation of content. And I think there'll be absolute merit in it producing content over time. I think it will always need human intervention. It can't come up with the ideas. It can't necessarily produce a story that's accurate. It needs checking, and it often needs enhancing because it's fairly basic what it can produce in terms of story writing and creativity. So yeah, I mean, look, I think anyone who's experimenting with AI at the moment in all its different forms and all the different things that it can do is doing the right thing. But I think at the very kind of base level, we've got to be transparent about where we're using it.
But I think that's interesting because that entirely comes from the perspective of somebody who's trying to kind of do this the right way, like publishers that are trying to do this the right way. And what I've seen is story after story about the bad actors and the people that are using generative AI to create and upload and sort of rewrite content for hundreds and hundreds of basically spam websites. And I see it sort of with the idea of getting a couple of ad dollars from Google. That to me is kind of the more frightening side of this, that especially when you come up to things like, you've got the US election, which is going to be hotly contested, you've got political stuff in the UK, that actually for audiences, like, how do they know where this stuff is coming from, who to believe? Like, it almost completely takes that trust and disinformation issue and expounds it almost infinitely. You just think generative AI can just create a website that looks like a local news site in, I don't know, an hour, minutes?
Yeah, and I think that bad actor thing is scary. I think that's where the legislation is going to have to come in order to ensure that there is transparency around AI. But I think longer term, and again, this is me with my glass half full again, isn't it? I think longer term, that kind of proliferation of bad actors around AI will come to reinforce why that human intervention and why journalism is so important. And at the moment, I think we struggle in a lot of cases to unlock the value in journalism, to show people how much value it has, We had this same thing when social media came out. How do we kind of differentiate ourselves from all of that that's happening on social media and all of the people who, claim to be reporters on social media reporting events? What we did to differentiate ourselves was kind of underline that trust in journalism. And I think it's going to be the same thing with AI, that we just need to keep reinforcing the kind of humanity and trust that journalism has and brings to that. And there also is going to need to be some legislation around AI as well.
That's a thorny topic. That's going to be. I saw a piece not too long ago. I can't remember who wrote it, unfortunately, talking about how the fact that we're still struggling to legislate the internet, let alone AI and generative AI. So that's a long and thorny road, particularly when you do have some of the platforms basically acting as laws unto themselves in a lot of cases. But obviously, you were talking there about sort of what the value that it can unlock. Now, when we're talking specifically about local journalism, there, what do you think it offers to local journalism in particular?
Well, I think, again, we are just at the start of it. I think it has tools that can make journalism more efficient. And I guess that's the first thing that people have gone to. Oh, I can do an interview online, and it can transcribe my interview and produce a piece of text that I can then work on in seconds, which, that sort of thing is really useful. It can provide metadata for articles and for images. It can help speed up research, albeit with the caveats that all of that information needs to be checked. There is absolutely a school of thought that says it can speed up a whole bunch of processes in a local newsroom, which gives time for the local journalists to go out and be out and about, doing interviews, talking to people, being in their communities. And I think that is a part of it. But I also think that over the coming 12 months, we'll get to a stage where AI is genuinely enhancing the journalism. It's bringing things into that reporting that we wouldn't otherwise have had, whether that's levels of kind of data analysis that we wouldn't have been able to do ourselves, or producing content that helps. You email 1,000 people in one go, that gives you responses that you wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. And so I think we're so much at the start of understanding the benefits that can have for a local newsroom. But I do think in time it will be able to it will change workflows. It will be able to speed up productivity, but speed up productivity in a way that can make the journalism better as well.
I don't know how much you can talk about what you were doing at Reach, but I think one of the biggest risks that we've talked about before is that this is seen as a tool, like as something that can replace journalists, especially in newsrooms where budgets are stretched. So I suppose, as somebody who's worked on looking at this tech in local newsroom settings, are efficient, like I'm quoting efficiencies, are they something that you see as a risk?
No, I don't see it as a risk, and I guess that again that goes back to the fact that at the moment AI can write a story but can't write a story very well. I think it has a better job of rewriting stories for audiences, so taking a story and producing a version of it that appeals to a different audience or a different group of people. That might help with the kind of content, I guess, that goes across multiple different audiences at Reach. I think some of the experiments that we were doing at Reach were around taking data and finding ways in which to interpret that data and produce stories from it. One of the first experiments at Reach was before I started using AI in any way, but during COVID, there was a really good widget set up to take the COVID data stats that were coming out every day and turn that into a piece of narrative, a piece of storytelling that the reporters could then take and rewrite and embellish and add to and publish. So that was a kind of very, very early use of AI storytelling in our newsrooms. But yeah, I think I don't think AI has yet done anything that makes it seem as though it could replace a journalist. And I think even at the point at which the storytelling through AI becomes better, more up to date, more accurate, even at that point, I think the human intervention is still going to be needed, and the skill will be in journalists understanding how to use AI to their advantage.
It's the whole thing is just so interesting. I mentioned just before we started recording, on December 31st, I stopped getting pitches about the metaverse and started getting pitches about AI. It was that fast. And generative AI seems to have been the switch that got flipped, because it became mass market enough that enough people could do it, that it became sort of widely recognized as being a game changer. But the speed with which the developments are happening is insane. Where do journalists need to be looking to stay abreast of all this kind of stuff? Because it is moving so fast that, I mean, I make it a point to try and stay abreast of this because I think the tech is fascinating. And even I'll go on Stable Diffusion subreddit after a week and be like, what is this? This is just magic. How is this possible? How has it leapt this far forward in a week? So where are you sort of looking to keep abreast of all this kind of stuff?
I think everywhere. I think we're going to need a different AI skills across our newsrooms. And so I think if you're a journalist now in a newsroom, I think the most important thing is that you're learning, understanding, reading, taking in whatever you can and trying things out. And that, as you say, it's changing all the time. There are going to be so many different ways in which that this tech can be used. But I think thinking first about why you'd want to use it and how it can make what you do better is probably your starting point. So yes, go out there and read everything and learn everything and try what you can. But when it comes to actually using AI to produce something in your work, I think you need to think about who's it for, how's this going to make it better, how can this enhance my journalism without just doing the job for me, but it can actually bring a multimedia element to my story that I might not have otherwise had, or it can adapt my story for a different audience that I wouldn't have been able to do without that AI tool.
The most recent edition of your newsletter, The Happy Journalist, which I absolutely loved, and I don't want to try and summarise it because you wrote it and I'm pretty worried about butchering it, but you kind of tied together some of the sort of subscription slowdown with AI, and your argument was that the measurement we should be looking at rather than sort of numbers now and engagement is actually impact. Could you just explain a little bit about that and how that ties into, I suppose, that sort of emphasising the value of humanity as generative AI really picks up?
My feeling of where we're going is that I think we started out when we moved to digital in almost all journalism organisations, media organisations. We were looking at reach, we were looking at scale, we were looking at driving audiences of scale. And I think over the last few years, those news organisations that were looking at scale have now focused much more closely on engagement and how we engage with readers and how we build relationships with readers. And I think that has, in a lot of cases, driven registrations, driven subscriptions. But we have started to see subscriptions plateau. So what's the kind of next step? Yes, we've engaged with those readers. Yes, we've built a relationship with those readers. But actually, we need to show that journalism has value in their day-to-day lives, and that it brings this value to them. So what's going to show that value? To me, that's impact. How can we show what impact journalism is having on people, on communities, on audiences? And that's something that I'm taking some time to look at and investigate how other industries use impact measurements. How can we take those impact measurements and apply them to journalism, and particularly local journalism. But I think that yes, there are three big forces shaping journalism at the moment. AI is one of them, and AI is the one that everyone's talking about. It's massive. But actually, climate and the climate crisis, I think, will be the next thing that it's always like the number 2 priority. It's never the top priority.
Yeah.
But actually, the climate crisis will shape journalism over the next decades. And news avoidance is something that I think is really pertinent to journalism at the moment as well. And I think if we can show the impact that journalism, that human journalism, has on society, on communities, on individual people, then I think we'll be in a much better place to unlock the value of journalism for readers, for advertisers, for investors, for governments, for all of those people who can support.
So really using it, holistically to support these other aims and goals that we need to be focusing on as well. So I think Peter's put it in the notes that there is a pushback from publishers against kind of the AI platforms. Just recently, we've seen a number of publishers basically forbid crawlers coming on to get data to train up their, AI platforms. To what extent do we feel like we're going to see a repeat of the conversations we had with search platforms around AI and sort of, what's fair recompense for using publisher data to train up these AI tools? And, is that going to be the next great fight between publishers and a third party?
Yes, I think it probably is. And I think it's great that some of those big media organisations have come out and taken that stance and started that debate. We can't wait for legislation to come along in order to control that. It'll just take too long. So I think the publishers have had to get on the front foot with that. And we've seen the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian have all sort of taken that step to stop the crawlers getting to their sites. I think it will be a big debate over the coming years. I think there will be some legislation that will impact this to a point, but I don't think it will ever solve the problem. And I think, like you say, it's likely to be a kind of a platform and publisher debate over the coming years.
I wonder if this is going to be one of those things that we look back in, I don't know, 10 years. And we always talk about the internet's original sin was letting content go away for free. I think this is like a sort of the second boot of that, where people who've had paywalls and things, like their stuff isn't getting crawled or shouldn't be getting crawled. And the people that have just let it go away for free, especially in the news industry, it's like, it just reinforces that. And I was reading a piece by somebody on Media Makers Meet where they were just saying, well, okay, the New York Times and the Guardian, they might be blocking the crawlers, but there are plenty of other sites that are covering exactly the same news stories that aren't. So the AI machine gets the stuff anyway, just maybe not quite to the same rigor and standard as the New York Times. So I just feel really pessimistic about it.
I know. I think it's so funny that every time we talk about it, regardless, we're just like, my thoughts immediately start leaning back towards the Terminator. And it's always like, it doesn't matter how optimistic we're trying to be about it. I'm just like, we start talking about the AI, the tech as this kind of like monolithic entity versus a bunch of different platforms all competing with one another for attention. It's fascinating how fast that kind of reputational shift has happened. But before, Jacqui, you were talking about transparency and how important that's going to be. We've seen places like Guardian, like Wired, put out basically explainers about what they are not using AI to do. Is that going to be what we come to expect publishers to do, to put out these basically statements about what they are and aren't going to do with AI?
Yes, and I actually think that's been a really good trend that we've seen over the last few months. I think a lot of publishers have made those statements, have made really clear kind of guidelines around what they want to do with Gen AI. The BBC, I think, released theirs this week, and it similarly to the Guardian, they talked about using AI in the best interests of the public. Ensuring that they were prioritising talent and creativity within any use of it, to be open and transparent about what they were doing, and it was similar guidelines to those that the Guardian had released before. And as you say, I think Wired were one of the first to come out with that set of AI guidelines as well. I think it is best practice again. I think it reinforces that relationship that we have with readers, that kind of human response to AI. It helps readers to understand where and why it's being used. I know a lot of publishers have started to put disclaimers on pieces of content that have been used, that have had some AI intervention. I think those are good too. I think they probably need to go further in that, where you see a disclaimer saying we've used AI in the production of this article. Well, kind of how and where and what role did it play? Because if it just helps you come up with a headline, then that's very different to it writing the entire piece of copy. So I think the more transparency we can give around that, the better. I think those statements of intent are really good, and I think we'll probably get to a point where we'll see. This might be some way in the future, but we'll see media companies actually putting disclaimers on pieces of content that have been wholly human created. Nothing on this site or in this article had AI intervention. It was all done with this lovely human who understands this piece of content because they have a particular expertise in this area, and it took them 3 days to produce this piece of content. And actually celebrating the kind of investment of time that's gone into content.
I see. That's so interesting. I wrote a piece for the Media Voices site a couple of months ago now, basically saying that I'd seen artists do exactly that. They basically documented the entire process of production from, inception through sketching, through line work, all the way through to colouring. And as a result, the provenance was there, and people could see that they had, it'd been created entirely by hand, using digital tools, obviously, but because the people were like sketching directly into, Photoshop or whatever. But using it as a point of differentiation is fascinating, because this time, 2 years ago, we would not have been thinking we'd have that conversation. The idea that you can use, this was made by a human, as like something that would set itself apart. And I really wonder how that's going to impact things like subscription marketing.
I was just thinking subscription businesses. Yeah.
That's so
absolutely
fascinating.
I think that'll be a big part of subscriptions, and I do think. I love it when I read those articles that are kind of behind the scenes and, how this court case unfolded and how this reporter sat for 6 months in this trial and what happened behind the scenes and the colour of that. Well, actually kind of taking that a step further to every article that has had a big investment of time and has a number of different components to it. Why aren't we saying this is how it was produced, this is what we did, this is who was involved? I think it comes back to the transparency, but it also comes back to the value. We're really reinforcing the value of journalism if we're talking about how much went into a piece of. I keep saying content, but
we can't get away from that word. Yesterday I saw a tweet, and I saw Matthew Ingram retweet it or repost it.
It's a post now.
Sorry. Basically saying, why should I put the effort into reading something that somebody didn't put the effort into creating? Which I thought was, I think, indicative of the sentiment around some AI generative stuff now, particularly that's relevant for journalism. One of the things that we should probably address is the impact that AI might have on existing players within the kind of the search market, because I've seen, Google is doing their AI generated search results. They're talking now about including AI summaries within browsers of articles, which I think is just going to be such a nightmare to negotiate with publishers, because it strips so much of the context away and so much of the sort of the craft of writing. If you're just doing a summary. Do we think then that this has the potential to destabilize the search market just as much as it does the creation and propagation of journalism?
I think it does, but I do think that we've already seen big steps forward in terms of how much search generative content Google is putting on results pages. So we're already seeing those huge blocks of text, the kind of information that you don't need to click through because you see it all as soon as you've searched for it. And that's already happening in Google. I think that's already impacted publishers as well. So I do think, yes, it can and probably will go a lot further, but I think it will be in small steps. And I think that, publishers have so much more moved towards that engagement with their readership, that kind of direct relationship, that yes, search is a big part of what drives audience to publishers, but actually it's a diminishing part, and I think that will be a diminishing part over the coming years as well. I think it'll be much more about those relationships that that publishers build with their audiences, and therefore there'll be a kind of, to a point, there'll be an understanding of what Google does is good for Google, right? So yeah.
I think we're all sort of aware of using ChatGPT to, limit or rather rewrite articles to fit a certain word length or to research, or I've even seen a couple of people who have been using it to really effectively teach themselves a new skill related to journalism, for instance, coding. But where would you see that, where would you advise people to go to really get started in understanding what is possible?
I mean, I think there are some brilliant courses out there. I think the LSE course around journalism AI has been a really good starting point for people. I've signed up to an awful lot of AI newsletters that give me information every day around the different types of tools that are coming out and the different things that you can do with them. And I think they're always a good starting point. I often pull out snippets from there and do some experiments on the back of those references. I mean, my advice would be to just start playing with it and just start using it. As you say, ChatGPT is definitely the best starting point. It's such a sort of accessible place to go and try things out. I think there is some good advice out there around how to do prompts that will bring you back the information that you need. Just sort of not just thinking about the content that you want, but thinking about the audience that you're there, thinking about the style of writing that you want that piece of content to be produced in. And then I've tried lots of things over the last couple of months around, as you say, like text to audio or text to video. Just trying out the kind of tools that can do that, and there are lots of them out there. And as you referenced, I mean, it's now got me into looking at, should I start to learn Python? Should I try and understand how to code? Because that will help, particularly with those big data analysis pieces. They're the kind of tools that could really help, like, enhance the journalism using AI. So I think I would advise just to play with it. But I think, and I'm sure that most publishers have something in place that says if you start to use that in a piece of content that you're producing, then you do need to be open and transparent about that, because we do need to think about what that means for an audience and how much we should articulate that to audiences as well.
I think the moment I realized that it was properly mainstream and the people were experimenting with it was when I went back up to Warrington, and my mum, who is the most tech literate person in the world, asked me to show her how to use it, and she's since been experimenting with it. But at the time, she went, okay, teach me how to use it. So I showed her how to use it to make a cover letter, and she was astonished by it. But then I went, okay, so just copy and paste that into an email, and she went, what? And she was equally impressed by copy and pasting as she was by this miracle of generative AI. So it's properly mainstream now.
It's properly mainstream. The first time I used it, I think, was end of last year. It was just before Christmas, and ChatGPT had just come out. I was going to book club, and I hadn't read the book, and so I asked ChatGPT to review the book for me. It was brilliant. Took it along to my book club. I say it was brilliant. Of course, it was a really quite badly written book review, but it did the job for.
I'd be way too paranoid to do that. Well, Jacqui, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a fascinating chat. Where can people find you if they want to read more of your work or about what you're doing on behalf of journalists with The Happy Journalist?
So The Happy Journalist is on Substack. Do come and check it out, and if you like it, drop me a line. Let me know what you think. I'm always keen to get people's feedback. And over the next few months, I'll be continuing to do experiments with AI and look at what AI is going to do, but also looking at other parts of journalism as well, and some of those other big forces that are shaping journalism at the moment. As I say, the climate crisis is something that I think we need to talk more about in journalism. I think news avoidance will be a big force to shape journalism over the coming months, and I think and that's what I'm trying to look at through The Happy Journalist, and so come and have a look.
I can highly recommend it. It definitely cheers me up at 9 o'clock at night when there are no other stories that are remotely positive in pocket.
Don't forget that that we'll be dealing with AI in slightly more depth in Media Moments, won't we?
Well, so one of the three of us has got to condense the entire year into 800 words for Media Moments 2023.
No, I'm sorry. It's not possible. I'll have to use ChatGPT to do that. Like, ooh.
Should we just get ChatGPT to write the chapter? Anyway, if you want to sign up to that report will be written by the three of us, I promise. You can pre-download that already at voices.media/mm23, and that will be released probably beginning of December. Human written, guys.
Point of differentiation. Yeah, all good. While you're going to voices.media, why not sign up to our newsletter, which takes a look at all the news and the views from the media world in 4 short stories. So we condense that down.
Human written.
Also human written. But you can also sign up to our community while you're there. We're having fascinating discussions on there. I'm sure we'll have a number of discussions about AI on the community forum. So you can sign up to that by going to voices.media. Thank you again to Jacqui for joining us for this episode. Thank you for listening. And we'll be back next week with another deep dive into a particular topic of relevance to journalism. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye. Really need a better sign-off. I was thinking about that guy who used to host You've Been Framed. And at the end of every episode, he'd go, and remember, I don't have a catchphrase. And that was his catchphrase for some reason. So we just need something along those lines.